Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Many of you know that in a past life I was actually a high school English teacher. And most of what I did was subject my students to books that I loved when I was growing up. And every year, when I would plan for the semester, I always made sure to start off with my favorite book. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Fahrenheit 451. This novel is, of course, written by Ray Bradbury, who was a prize-winning science fiction writer. In his world of Fahrenheit 451, we are sometime in the future where everything has been dramatically turned upside down. Our protagonist is actually a fireman named Guy Montag. But in this world, Guy doesn't put out fires like a normal firefighter would do. Instead, in this world, he starts fires. You see, in Bradbury's book, Guy Montag's job is to find books and burn them. Now, for me, this is a very interesting concept. According to Bradbury's novel, books contain ideas, and ideas are dangerous. So the powers that be want to limit free thought, and they make books illegal. This, unfortunately, is what fascist regimes actually do. They burn books in the street. Hitler did this, Stalin did this, Mussolini did this, etc., etc. Now, with social media, foreign dictatorships have entire teams that find and edit what they deem as propaganda, and they eliminate that as well. So as I mentioned, I think this is a very interesting and kind of a frightening concept. I'm an avid reader, and the idea that someone could infringe upon my rights as an American and burn my precious books, genuinely frightening to me. However, when we read this book as a class, my students, who I taught at a very, very low-income school, they were not readers. They watched TV. They played video games. For most of them, English wasn't their first language, and many of them worked second-hand jobs to help their families make ends meet. They had not the time, nor the luxury, nor the capacity to devote to reading for pleasure. So for them, they were not entirely uncomfortable with the idea that someone would burn something that they had no interest in using in the first place. And this really kind of irked me. I remember seeing a quote from Ray Bradbury himself sometime later, and it said this, quote, "You don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. You just have to get people to stop reading them." And it turns out that what is killing literacy among young people isn't a lack of access to books. There are plenty of free public libraries. It's a lack of interest, a lack of ability to engage with books. If we put this idea on hold for a moment, we could discuss a lot of interesting concepts from the Parsha for this week. It turns out that Parshat Tetze has a lot of commandments, a lot of mitzvot that we could go over. This is actually the mitzvah Parsha. There are 70 different mitzvot in this Parsha that deal with a whole variety of topics, from workers' rights to animal rights to what to wear, how to bury your excrement, not making this up, how to stone your rebellious son. You heard me correctly. If you're interested in that, you're going to hear Brylan talk all about that tomorrow. There's instructions on how to capture and marry a wife. I did not write this. Instructions for building a fence on the top of your roof. Trust me, there is a lot to cover in this Parsha. So you mentioned burying excrement, and everybody is scooting forward at the end of their seat. But then randomly at the end of the Parsha, there's a verse that sticks out like a sore thumb. There's really no context to it. It doesn't look like it should even be there. This is from chapter 25, verse 19. It says, quote, "Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. how undeterred by fear of God, Amalek surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers of your rear. Therefore, when Adonai grants you safety from all your enemies around you, in the land that Adonai your God is giving you, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And then it says 3 words, do not forget. Good old Amalek. We've got to blot his name out. If you'll remember, back in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot, the Amalekites made war against the Jewish people while we were wandering. And Moses lifted his hands while Joshua fought them in battle. And every time his hands got weary, Joshua and his army started to lose the battle. But when he would raise them back up, Joshua and his army would begin to prosper again. Now, I'm willing to bet, friends, that if I gave you a microphone and a clipboard and had you stand on Las Vegas Boulevard on a busy night, if you interviewed 100 people and asked them, who is Amalek? You might get about a dozen people who know what in the heck you're talking about. And most of them would be Jews. Several of them would be drunk Jews. By the way, why do the Jews know who Amalek is? Because according to tradition, Haman, boo, thank you, somebody did it. Haman is a descendant of Amalek. Really, the only 2 reasons Jews know about Amalek is because of rabbis like me talking about him during this Parsha, or because mainly during the holiday of Purim. This is quite the paradox here. The Jews are the ones that are supposed to blot out the name of Amalek, so history does not remember him or his tribe. But in reality, we are the ones that are keeping him relevant. I once saw an interview that African-American actor Morgan Freeman did on 60 Minutes. And in it, he referred to Black History Month as, quote, ridiculous. He said that Black history is American history, and he said it made no sense to relegate Black history to just 1 month. And finally, after going back and forth with the reporter asked, well, Mr. Freeman, how are we going to eliminate racism? Stop talking about it, he quickly retorted. It seems like Morgan Freeman, his concept of racism, and Bradbury's books, and even Amalek, if we truly want to get rid of them, we should simply stop talking about them. But can this be right? Well, certainly, passivity has had huge, disastrous effects on many communities. If we look at statistics for people who vote during a presidential election, in a good turnout year, maybe 60% of eligible voters will make it to the polls. That means 40% either can't make it for some reason or don't care enough to attempt. Just within the Jewish community, I can tell you from hearing this term, silent Holocaust, drilled into my brain every day during rabbinical school, that statistically we have lost more Jews in the past 100 years to passivity. They just don't care anymore. So unfortunately, there is evidence that ignoring a situation or remaining passive about it, it can make it go away, but not in the way we want it to. The reason why we boo for Haman, boo, thank you, and talk about Amalek is because our people realize that there is power in acknowledging the hardships that our ancestors faced. Because as our tradition teaches, in every generation, unfortunately, there will be a new Amalek, or Haman, or Hitler, or Hamas that attempts to rise up against us and systematically destroy our people and burn our precious books. The reason why we have to have difficult conversations about assimilation is because we want there to be a next Jewish generation. The reason many people have protested and boycotted and had difficult conversations about equality in America is because they feel like racism is a conversation that shouldn't be silenced. They feel like it should be talked about more. In the book Fahrenheit 451, Guy Montag, the fireman, realizes that ignoring his conscience wasn't the right thing to do. He had grown up hearing that books were bad and that books were evil, but when he finally opened one up, he understood that that simply wasn't the case. Instead of burning books, he begins to save them, and ultimately, he begins memorizing them so he can pass these books on to the next generation. Literally, he began retelling these stories, Lador Vador, from one generation to the next. So, dear friends, tonight I leave you at a crossroads with a paradox. How do we blot out Amalek's name, but at the same time make sure he doesn't attempt to rise up against us again? We talk about him and his descendants through the boos and hisses. We stamp our feet in disgust, but friends, we never forget. We can never forget, and we can never stop teaching our children. They may burn our books in the streets, but our children will be the next generation to write them again. Shabbat Shalom.